But Vidit says, it's fine. You know, I have active knights also. You mustn't forget that if black had taken here, Vidit would have taken the pawn on a7. So Magnus defends it, and now the pawn on h4 is hanging. So Vidit quickly brings his knight there to defend. The knight jumps into the e4 square, now threatening a check to win the a2 pawn. So Vidit, down to 2 minutes on the clock. This is how Magnus puts pressure on his opponents in the end games. He makes his moves quickly. He makes logical moves. He understands the harmony of pieces beautifully. But for the time being, Vidit has everything under control. So the king comes into e7, just improving the king's possibilities. The king cannot go anywhere further because the f7 pawn would be hanging. You can't kick the knight because then the g6 pawn hangs. So Vidit waits with king e1, and he tells Magnus that, look, I feel that everything is safe here. You can't make progress. Magnus goes knight g8. Knight f6. Where is he going with his knight is the million-dollar question. Knight g5. The knight goes back to d6 because he had to defend the f7 pawn. And now king comes up, knight d7, offering a trade of knights. You can take here, but then the king might want to come here and play b5. So Vidit gives a check. The king goes back to e8. What has really worked in Magnus's favor is Vidit's time. He's down to 42 seconds while Magnus has 3 minutes 30 seconds. Vidit brings his king up. Maybe Vidit wants to play f3 and e4. That way he would be expanding. Knight comes to f5, attacking the h4 pawn. Vidit brings back his knight to defend it. And where is Magnus's next move? What is it going to be? Well, he brings his knight to f6. I love how he swivels the knight there. Looking here and here, king goes back to e2 and knight g8. Knight goes back to g8 because he wants to trade off a pair of knights with knight e7. Well, the board is Magnus's playground there, and his knights are creating a nightmare for Vidit, who is down to 20 seconds. You see, the pressure occurs on every side of the chessboard with Magnus playing on the queen side, king side, on the clock, everywhere. Pawn takes pawn. Knight takes the pawn, and now Vidit has managed to exchange more pieces, but if you see, he now has a weakness on a4 as well as h4. Knight goes to e7, just improving his position very slightly. As we all know, Magnus never ignores any of his pieces, and he's improved that. Knight goes back to d3 for Vidit, and the knight may want to go to e5 square. Knight c8, love this move. The knight is coming to d6, to e4, to c4, and this knight will have great possibilities. Knight comes in the center. Magnus moves his knight with it. Again down to 20 seconds. Magnus still up on time, 3 minutes. Knight goes to c6. The knight is actually threatening nothing, and Vidit can maybe wants to play his knight somewhere. f6, taking control of the square. The knights now can't move there. Time-wise, with it down to last 10 seconds. Plays his knight back to b4. Magnus moves in. Now the threat is a check to win the pawn. How did Magnus manage to put so much pressure on his opponent? Wow. Brilliant play there. Maybe with it can... Oh, he goes knight a2. Stopping it. Stopping knight c3. And now Magnus bringing his king in. Maybe he's threatening here, here, here. He wants to come to a5. A very good way to continue is then to simply move the king away, and if king c6, knight b4, you give up your pawn there and then play knight d3 coming to f4. That's how you gain counterplay. But Vidit blunders here with knight d2. Vidit under pressure. He was 2 seconds on the clock. His position was difficult. His knight couldn't move from f3 nor from a2, but now he's played knight d2, and actually Magnus Carlsen with 3 minutes on the clock sees his opportunity. He sees that the h4 pawn is hanging. He takes on d2, king takes d2 and chops off the pawn. He's pawn up in this knight endgame, and guys, you know that knight endgames are like pawn endgames. If you are one pawn up, it is a winning position. Knight goes back to f5. Vidit plays his knight to d3. He is threatening to come here to attack the pawns on e6 and g6, but Magnus nips it right in the bud with g5. What an endgame player Magnus Carlsen is. King c3. Maybe Vidit wants to create play here with his king, but the black king is ready, already to come to c6. He plays it. King goes to c6. Vidit waits now with king d2. Is this win still difficult to convert for Magnus, or is it easy? He brings his knight back to d6. He's looking at the e4 square. He's looking at the c4 square. Later he can start pushing his pawns. Vidit plays his pawn up to f3, stopping knight from coming to e4. And Magnus plays king b7. Cool little move. The idea is to come here to a5 and attack the pawn on a4. Knight f2 played, and king a6 by Magnus. e4 played right in the center of the board, and I think Magnus will just take. Yes, pawn takes, and now he has the g passer. He goes a5. He wants to win the a pawn. Then he will have the b passer, then the g passer. Slowly and steadily, the game is going out of control and out of hand for Vidit. He loses his second pawn, and Magnus Carlsen is in the driver's seat totally. Pawn to e5. Takes, pawn takes, and now Magnus has to calculate. Look at how he's made perfect use of his time. That's so beautiful to see. Magnus still has 2 minutes 10 seconds on the clock. He attacks the pawn on e5. Vidit defends it. Maybe it's the right time now to start pushing your b pawn down the board, because everything seems to be under control. But Magnus plays his knight back to e8, d8. Maybe he wants to give a check here. That could be a possibility. And also you will see that b5 would have allowed maybe the king to come in. So that's the reason why he did not go for it straight away. g4 played. The pawn moves one step closer, but Vidit says that pawn is weak. I'm going to go and capture it. Magnus says, be my guest, take that pawn, but my b pawn will start to queen. Vidit goes in, king f4. Magnus cannot defend that pawn anymore, but he pushes his pawn and adjusts his pieces. b4 has been played. Vidit chops off the pawn. He's now just one pawn down. Can he manage to hold this position? Well, Magnus says not really. b3 played. The b pawn is going to net the knight's life, and then black still has another pawn to win the game. King g5 played, and now king wants to come into f6 and e7. So first goes knight c6, and the important point here is that if you go king f6, I have knight to d4 defending the pawn. That's why Vidit plays a check here. And now king b4, yes, if you take on e6, there is b2, b1 queen. And if you take on b3, I just take with my king. The game is over. Vidit down to his last few seconds, and he gives his hand in resignation. Magnus Carlsen wins it. What a guy.